Hello, I'm Gabrielle, a representative from Waterloo Region School Food Guidance, and I'll be interviewing Marishka from South Riverdale Community Health Center, who is a kitchen facilitator that has lots of experience in culinary works, which is why we're here to interview her today. I'd like to start with the first question, which is part of the introduction, which is, what does your program hope to achieve?
So my program within the Community Health Center, I work for a community food center, and basically in a really broad way, we're trying to connect people and connect them all over food. So just creating environments and discussions where people can talk about food and their connections to food, whether that's cultural or emotional, or whether it's something that they know and they can teach other people. So it's sort of focusing on the discussion of food and community and how they connect. Yeah.
The second question is, what made you enter the food industry, and did you have any ideas against the food industry beforehand?
So it was a pretty organic, natural process for me. When I was a kid, when I was in grade 5, I became a vegetarian, so I cooked for myself all the time and was just really interested in food and making food. And then I guess growing up, I had different jobs where I would work at a summer camp and would work in the kitchen part-time, or work in a daycare kitchen, stuff like that. And through university, I had quite a few jobs around food. So it's always just been something that I've been really comfortable with and really interested in. And then at a certain point, I got kind of interested in nutrition and growing food. So I'm kind of interested in all of it, really. And I think just my skill set brought me into working with food. It wasn't something that I necessarily had planned to do. I more wanted to work in community settings and kind of creative things. So I've kind of found myself there. But I think it can be so varied what you can do working in food that I don't know that I had any conceptions about it going in, but I'm just constantly learning how much you can do.
I think that's really important for everyone to know, that you don't have to have a path straight away, and especially in the food industry, which is often not brought to light as much. You can still find a job that you're happy with, even if you're not 100% certain.
Oh, for sure. And I think what I do now is such a mix of different experiences that I've had, working with kids, and as a teenager, I taught snowboarding. So just all these different things that teach you how to teach people, or how to work with groups, or how to, manage a kitchen. I've gotten from so many different places that I think, there's definitely people who are I want to be an accountant, and they study accounting and go and do that. And then I think there's a huge section of people who kind of go through life just following what they're interested in, and it can lead you to a lot of really cool jobs.
My third question is, how does switching to virtual affect your personal objectives?
For me, I find virtual really hard. I really like working with people in person and kind of letting things develop around people's skills and what they're good at. And I find it much easier to connect with people, and especially in the sort of work that I do, it's so based around community and around food that it's pretty challenging to do it virtually. I do think it's a good challenge, and it helps develop skills that I maybe wouldn't have had before, or it makes me be a bit more creative in my approach to my work. But it is a challenge for sure.
Talking about challenges, are there challenges you faced recently in your role, and how did you overcome them?
Yeah, so the pandemic for sure has been a massive challenge for everything that we do at the food center. I think it's also highlighted how important our work is and how many people we can connect with, kind of with food and community. But yeah, definitely all of our programming being virtual at the moment is a huge challenge. And then we've moved our community meal from what would be seated indoors and sort of more of a communal setting to an outdoor, where people are outdoors and they come and just pick up the meal. And normally that program would have a bunch of volunteers that would come and work with us every week. And it's just really a skeleton crew of people working on it, which can be fairly challenging, I would say. Again, it's always about figuring out the best way you can do what your goal is with the limitations you have. So I've definitely learned a lot about streamlining how we're trying to deliver the meals and stuff, which I think has been a good learning experience.
With moving on to virtual, you mentioned that you had to make the food takeaway instead of actually having it with everyone in the present. Do you think it's opened up more opportunities as well for you?
So for our virtual programs, we've tried to do it a few different ways just to get a sense of what worked best for people. And so we've done it when we've created sort of a meal kit that people would normally have delivered or would pick up, and it has everything they need. We've done it when they receive like a weekly produce box, and then we talk about different ways to use the produce in it. Those programs, like, we would never normally run something like that. Normally people would come and we'd all cook a meal together and we'd all eat it. So I think the benefits are really different potentially. And I think the way that the programs are running now maybe help more with like food security a bit more for families, because they're kind of getting food that they can eat as a family, but maybe they're losing a bit on the social aspect. So it's a bit, and everything's push and pull, I guess.
The last question of the introduction is, what is cooking to you?
Oh wow, that's a simple but big question. I've always really liked cooking, and I think people can come at cooking really different ways. So for me, I really like experimenting. I'm like the type of person who, like, if I see a menu, I'll always look through the whole thing and see what's out there. So I'm always kind of picking up new things and thinking about how to use them and trying out new recipes. So for me, I think it's a really creative thing. And when I talk to people about cooking and kind of do cooking programs, I try really hard to help people have that kind of relationship with food. I also just think that cooking is a really easy way to connect different people, because everyone eats and everyone kind of has some sort of connection to food and cooking, even if it's really different than mine.
I feel like cooking has become such a large part of everyone's culture, regardless of where you come from. And I think it's really beautiful to see that cooking can mean such a large aspect to you.
Yeah.
The next topic that we're on is about accessibility. And the first question is, do you think cooking is accessible to everyone?
I think cooking can be accessible to everyone, depending on how you approach it. One of the things I've really noticed with doing this program, and especially with doing cooking programs where we're sending stuff home and people are cooking from home, is you really can't assume that people have all these different tools. You know, so if you're Western and you use a cheese grater all the time, you might assume that everyone has a cheese grater, but you know, like a lot of cultures don't use cheese graters. So it's kind of constantly learning to figure out how to make things really accessible. And I think that's a journey it's hard to kind of know just intuitively. And then, you know, there's different types of accessibility. Some recipes might be challenging if people have some sort of mobility issues, but I think it can be accessible. It's just finding, you know, what tools you need to make it accessible.
The second question is, how does the organization and program help with accessibility to the people of Toronto?
Yeah, so I think for our program, I would say, you know, it's probably not widespread to Toronto. We do kind of work in a community, and our goal is to kind of create a hub within that community. So I'd say we're pretty specific to kind of the East Toronto kind of West Scarborough area. I think it in different ways, you know, whether it's people coming for a takeout meal or people accessing a cooking program or accessing emergency food supports. And I think for us, we're kind of constantly looking at who's accessing which programs and why, and then looking at where there's gaps and how to best suit people. So one of the things we noticed that were a lot of kind of newcomer young families were joining our cooking programs. So we started thinking about, you know, should we have a newcomer cooking program? Because these people have tons of skills and they have, you know, really interesting cultural foods that they cook, that they're knowledgeable about cooking. So it's like, you know, maybe they come together and we do that, and that's maybe a more beneficial experience for them. So I think it's just always looking at who's accessing your program and why, and how to kind of best serve those communities. And asking them, you know, people know what they need, and they're normally pretty willing to tell you if you take time to have that conversation.
Talking about newcomers and accessing your program, do you feel like youth are part of the newcomer population, if you will, in your program?
Yeah, I would say my coworker definitely works with more youth than I do. I kind of work with, generally, just the way that we've done our programming, I'm normally working with kids who are quite young, like I'd say primary school age, and then adults. And she has a youth program. And I think probably a lot of them are like second generation or first generation where their parents had immigrated here. And I think it is accessible to them, but it's a hard age, I think especially at the moment with so much virtual school, that I think people are tired. They maybe, are a little less willing, and it can be harder to kind of get a sense of where people are at when everything's virtual. But I think there's definitely accessibility there.
For the people who can't access it as easily due to COVID barriers, what do you think makes access to cooking and health education way easier?
I think it's, keeping those conversations going. So however you're meeting with your community, I think, a lot of that's virtual. It's just talking and figuring out where people are at and what they need, and then, taking it from there.
I feel like also sometimes it's not as easy to see the gaps, even though I know you've been working for a long time in this area. Still, sometimes there's some areas that are just not as transparent to you. And so I can imagine that's also a kind of handicap to reaching people.
For sure. I think one of the really nice things about the nature of sort of community work is that people want to share. So there's, other organizations who do work in our neighborhood. And it's just really, I think networks are really, really important, and being able to kind of connect with people in different ways. So, whatever that looks like, I think it's just creating connections with different people from different organizations really helps to kind of get a sense of the community.
Do you think that social media has increased accessibility to food and localized food systems?
I think it can, for sure. I think with social media, it's all about who you're following, right? And what you're connected to. So if you're connected to people and organizations who are talking about that, absolutely. But I wouldn't say it's necessarily widespread. It's really, sometimes those things can be like a little bit of an echo chamber, But I think that the possibility of that is huge. And I think we've seen throughout the pandemic so many different grassroots organizations popping up that are interested in food work and are interested in community. So I think social media has a huge potential that's really interesting, especially for community organizing.
It just goes to show that social media can be a helpful thing to use, especially because ever since the pandemic, lots of people have become aware that there's lots of local food systems and food organizations that they can source from, but it's only because of the pandemic in combination with social media that people get to access that.
Totally. I think social media really helps to tell stories that are maybe not always told or aren't always given the platform to be told. Given that you can also share things in social media really easily, I think it can have a pretty cool effect.
What does accessibility mean to you?
Accessibility means to me understanding how people access things. So I guess it's just going back to the word access, but looking at what that truly means and understanding how it affects different people. Yeah.
Second topic is safety, and the first question from it is, do you think that Toronto is a place where food is safe to access for all?
That's a tough question. I think not necessarily. And I think if you are kind of talking about the pandemic and how that affects people's access to food, it can be huge, especially for a low-income family that has to take the bus to the grocery store and all the interactions that they're going through. They may not feel safe. I also think safety is such a personal thing where one person might feel safe in a situation, another person might not. When I think about safety, I kind of think about the food system as a whole and who has access and what that access looks like. And I think that conversation has become much more open in the last few years. So even just thinking about accessibility and what we were talking about before, I'm sure there's gaps that I'm not aware of or that you're not aware of that are very real to some people. And I think by putting that conversation on the table really openly and just talking about it, that we can kind of figure out, how to make food safe for everyone or how to make it accessible for everyone.
Do you feel like this was talked about pre-pandemic, or do you feel like post-pandemic is when people are realizing this and having this discussion?
I think that, stuff like that I find really hard because it's hard to know how widespread things are. So I've been really interested in food security for a long time, but it's hard to know for me if I'm just in that kind of echo chamber where it's people are really influenced and really passionate about it. So I think it's hard to tell in a truly widespread way, but I do think that people experiencing challenges trying to access food, no matter what their income is, through the pandemic has maybe shed a bit of light on what that can feel like for other people. And I think that understanding is pretty important for seeing like the big picture of what food access is like in Toronto and Canada.
I feel like it's also given lots of people in Canada compassion for those who have been dealing with such issues even pre-pandemic. And I feel like that's another reason why food can give you new experiences, especially if you're trying to access things like that, especially in a safe manner, which means that you either have to go to the grocery store or even getting it delivered to you could be a whole challenge to some people.
Yeah, totally. Absolutely.
How do you educate people about food safety with your program and organization? And how do youth play a part in this?
Yeah, so I think for me, with trying to teach those sort of skills, it's just sort of talking about it all the time. When we're talking about like food safety in a very like basic conception of food safety, like how is it safe to handle food? For me, I think it's keeping it as simple as possible. I think there are a lot of ways that people cook food and handle food at home that their families have always sort of done. And it's not technically safe if you're looking at like true food safety. So I think it's just having those conversations and not ostracizing people and explaining things in a really basic way. That I think that's a big way for me. And I think it's the same with youth, you know, having those conversations. Like, you always wash your hands before you handle food? You always sanitize areas before you handle food? You're thinking about the temperatures that foods are at. So I don't think food safety can be really complicated, but it can also be really simple. So for me, it's just about keeping it simple and just keeping that conversation like consistent and fluid.
I can imagine that the more you complicate something, the more it's harder for the audience to apply that to themselves, because often simplicity helps people relate it to themselves and their own experiences and what they cook. And I feel like that's a really amazing way to connect people with how they could incorporate food safety into their cooking.
Totally.
Why is it important to make local programs about safety and food?
For things to be truly enjoyable, they need to be safe, right? So I think when someone's maybe new to cooking and they don't have all the experiences that other people might have, it's just important to bring safety into that so that they feel confident in their skills going forward. You know, like if you make something and then you feel sick after it, you're probably not that excited to do it again. But if you kind of bring in that safety at the beginning, I think it kind of sets the right foundation.
I also feel like it's important to realize that safety has a different meaning for each person. Going back to your point about the first question, how you're saying that in the pandemic, it's harder for people to feel safe when accessing resources that are food and ingredients, of course. Would you like to expand on how you mean that safety affects how we can get resources?
Yeah, so I think it's hard because it's about people's personal conceptions of what's safe for them. But I think, it's obviously challenging if you don't feel that safe getting on the bus and you don't feel that safe going into a grocery store to access food.
Okay.
Yeah, it can be really challenging. Some people have to travel a really long way to get food, and then maybe they don't like traveling to get food at certain times of the day. It becomes really complicated. I think when food isn't readily available for people in their own communities, that's appropriate for them to access. And, maybe some people feel more comfortable shopping for their cultural foods within their own communities, and that could feel like safety for them as well. I think it's it can be really complicated.
What has the organization currently achieved with food education?
The program that I work in is pretty new. I think we're about a year and a half into our official launch. I think we've really laid a good groundwork for how we want to be working in the community and figuring out different ways to access people. And I think for us, it's just creating those relationships with people so far has been the biggest achievement, because I think by creating those relationships, we're really learning about our community and getting them involved, which is obviously what will lead to like the best success of the programs.
Is there any way that students in virtual programs or even parents who are working at home could implement the relationships that you're discussing with us?
Yeah, so I think a lot of the time we have different like neighborhood organizations that we work with to get to know people and know different groups. And then once we get to know them, it's sort of what I was saying, it's like understanding where people are at and seeing who's interested. We definitely noticed that there's a trend of young families. So one of the programs we did last year was families cooking together. So we'd send a hamper of healthy food that a kid and a parent could cook together, and we'd all virtually make dinner together. And I would say they really influenced the program because it's seeing like, is this manageable for them to do? Are they interested in it? And it's sort of balancing, like, are they learning? Are they comfortable? So I think, you know, the community and the participants are totally having an influence over everything we do because they're sort of why we're there, right? So they kind of become the driving force of our programming.
I feel like in that sense, you're also creating memories that stick with people, whether it be memorizing a recipe that you do together on the program, or whether it's even cooking with someone. I feel like those memories are really important in the times that we're in, especially now.
Yeah, it's really fun. Like last week we did a PA Day workshop with kids where they were making like caterpillars and snails with celery and fruit. And I had so many emails from parents afterwards saying like, I couldn't believe they were eating celery. And one of them, the mom was working and the kid was watching. And the mom said that when she came back, the kid was so excited to show her what she'd learned. So it's just really fun, and it's really nice hearing feedback like that because we can kind of tell, you know, it's working.
How do you incorporate fun into your programs and activities, or what are some methods that you have to create fun in your programs?
I'm pretty silly naturally. That's sort of my personality. So whenever I do programs, like I'm always making jokes, I'm always talking to people, I'm always trying to, you know, if someone talks about something they made, I'm like, well, tell me more, or, you know, trying to get people to relate, and just making it lighthearted, you know, and being honest. Like, not everything you make is going to taste good. So it's like, taste it. Does it taste bad? Okay, let's talk about it. Like, I just find like with cooking and stuff, it's like, make it lighthearted, make it fun. If it's not good, that's fine. Who cares? You're cook something else. Like, you know, I think especially when some people are new to things, they can feel stressed out about doing really well at it. But I think it's understanding, like, especially with cooking, it's all about learning. It's all about taking chances. It's all about trying new things and then just laughing when it doesn't work out. You know?
I think that's a very important skill to have, and also part of the growth mindset of many people. Do you think there's an impact only participants can make on Toronto's health and food culture?
Yeah, I think for sure. And I think it's sort of, I think we can kind of see threads through what we've been talking about, that there's things that, you know, that we don't know about, and we won't know about them until people kind of have a voice to talk about them, which I think is the biggest thing with participants. So everyone eats food, everyone buys food, you know, so already everyone's making an impact on food systems. And when we give people more choices, they will naturally navigate to what is best for them. For me, you know, identifying the system that the food system is, and the opportunities and the barriers, and just looking at those and discussing them all the time.
I also feel like it also reduces the junk food that we intake, which is potentially just empty calories, and making something that's much more filling, and at the same time also making an impact on the health on your body, and also the health of local farmers, local producers, and grocery stores. What aspects of the pandemic makes it difficult to motivate others?
I think people are really burnt out. You know, I'm sure you are. I felt pretty burnt out too. It just seems to be ongoing, which I think is really hard. But I think it's finding the things that people find joy in, and luckily, you know, a lot of the time that it's food. You know, you're stuck at home, but like, let's make something fun. Let's do it virtually together. Let's talk about it, and maybe you learn something new, or you have a new thing that you can share with your friends. So I think it's just finding ways to continue to connect with people, despite the barriers that we've, you know, all been facing for the past few years, and, you know, finding those moments of joy and those moments of community and stuff like that.
I feel like you've mentioned discussions frequently in this interview, and I feel like it shows that discussions are really a part of moving things forward and involving a lot of the talks we don't have into modern conversations, especially because some aspects of the food culture, such as cooking, is only seen on the surface level. And so I feel that mentioning discussions and communication is really valuable to the audience. How has food motivated people around you to interact and connect during pre-pandemic and in post-pandemic times?
Like on a personal level, I think it's also my interest in my friends, but like getting together and having dinner, having a barbecue, and just sharing recipes and having fun is definitely a huge part of my life. I think it becomes a bit harder during the pandemic, but it's maybe you follow someone whose food you think is really cool on Instagram and you share that with your friends. So I think there's constantly these ways to connect over food. I'm definitely very curious to see what it'll be like in a post-pandemic world, because I think everything's kind of shifting. I think community and food will always be really important, so I'm interested to see how it will be different, but I don't know what it will be.
Do you feel like the lessons we've learned in the pandemic will continue into post-pandemic?
The pandemic, coupled with a lot of other things that are going on in the world, there's been a lot of conversations about barriers. Like even when, the vaccines were kind of rolling out and people were talking about who has access to them and who doesn't. I think these conversations have become a lot more present in day-to-day life, which I think is really important. I think that'll keep going. I hope it does.
The last topic we have is about culture, and the first question is, has food played a part in your cultural identity?
Absolutely, and I find it really interesting. I have a super Polish name, but both my parents are from England. I had a Polish grandparent, and I didn't grow up with a lot of Polish food, but because my name's so Polish, people always talk to me about Polish food. And I had gone to visit a friend in Winnipeg when I was like 13 or something, and there's tons of kind of Polish and Ukrainian food, and it was so exciting trying all these food that I haven't had. Like I'd never had pierogies, which are so delicious. And I think it's just really interesting, talking to people about their food. People, I find for the most part, are really interested in telling me about how they cook food. And I've definitely found that in programs, which is conversations I love to have. So doing a program, if I'm making, like a Bengali curry, I'm like, what do you guys put in this? Would you do something different than me? Let's talk about it. It's not like I know something that other people don't know. I might have more experiences than them, and they might have so many more than me. It's really cool. I think that one of the coolest things is sort of this like fusion food that we see a lot now, where, like my partner's mom is Ukrainian and Chinese, and she'll make these like really wild dumplings that are sort of a mix of both cultures. And to me, stuff like that is just so exciting and so fun.
I feel like it also helps fill the gap or the questions that you have about your culture, especially with how many different cultures make up the Canadian population.
Totally.
Takes up a large percentage of that, and I think it's really cool that your program caters to so many people and so many different cultures, and I feel like food makes a lot of people feel at home, because when you have a good meal, you feel at rest. The second question is, how has food connected participants?
When it comes to food and how people cook food, and I think you see the same things in growing food, is everyone comes with so many experiences, and I think it's really empowering for people to talk about their experiences, which I've definitely noticed in my groups, so it's just creating those platforms where people feel comfortable talking and engaging those conversations, which I think is really cool.
I feel like it is really important to have not only you connect with the participants, but also the participants with each other, because if there's frequent people who frequently attend, chances are that there's probably a meal that they're going to connect over in the future. Do you think that all cultures find accessing their cultural foods easy? If so, how?
I don't think people find it easy. I think people find it really hard. And I think it's, when we talk about these systems, I think it's one of the biggest things that's an issue in a city like Toronto. And a lot of the time, food that would be what a certain culture is looking for is going to be way more expensive than other things, which I think is really problematic. So I think it's a problem, and it's something that just needs to be talked about more. And I think, you know, the more you shed light on things like that, the more opportunities there are for change. And I think there's lots of different ways to create that change.
Well, thank you so much for doing this interview. I'm sure that lots of people have learned a lot from what you told us and your experiences in the food industry, and also having culinary experience under your belt. I'm sure that lots of people are looking forward to either looking to your program to try it out or even trying to cook themselves.
Yeah, it's really nice talking with you.